I think we found ourselves a clue.
Scooby-Doo, where are you? Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Now, this show takes me back. Despite it airing in the late 60s, and me being an early 90s kid, I still managed to become a fan of this in my youth, thanks in small part to constant reruns and my mother buying me tons of VHS tapes. Still, it's probably been more than a decade since I last saw this show, so what do I think of it in 2016? Well, that's what you'll find out as I review all 3 seasons. Now, episode 1, What a Night for a Night, is what started it all. And while I do believe this show is timeless in general, some parts have definitely aged more than others. For one, I'd completely forgotten that this show even had a laugh track, which probably was common for shows back then, and was actually started by this show. Unfortunately, it does get more than a bit grating, as I'm not one to enjoy being told what to laugh at. So while there were humorous moments in this episode, the laugh track almost had the opposite effect on me, making me not find certain parts funny because of its inclusion. Now, coming off of Be Cool Scooby-Doo, it's weird to realize how much the comedy differs from the first show to the most recent iterations. I'm a fan of the newest iteration of this classic franchise, but I am left to marvel at how much more subdued or subtle the comedy is in this episode, aside from the near constant laugh track, I mean. Really, the laughs come from things like seeing Scooby scramble away from the Black Knight by hiding in a flower pot. Or Shaggy and his faces when they laugh. Again, a bit more subtle than the humor we've seen in more recent takes. And that's not even me saying one is better than the other. It's just fun to note how much this series has evolved over the years. But maybe I should try to focus more on this episode and not the series in general. So moving on, we all know the general plot of these early episodes, so there's not really much to say about it. The gang happen upon an empty truck aside from a suit of armor and decide to investigate what happened to its driver. This eventually leads them to the museum, which they do end up breaking into at one point in a very hilarious way, in order to find the missing archaeologists. There were some scenes throughout the episode that didn't really make sense to me, such as Shaggy walking past Velma, clear as day, and then her immediately exclaiming that they'd lost him.
Oh no! We lost Shaggy!
So, if there is one negative beyond the annoying laugh track, it would be the moments in the episode that felt awkwardly placed together. It's hard to really fault the show for this, as this was a much different time for children's cartoons, but I still think some internal logic need apply to scenes flowing one to the other. There's another scene like this where Scooby runs into Shaggy and the gang, but then immediately afterwards, Shaggy and Scooby have to go looking for them? I mean, I suppose Fred, Velma, and Daphne walked away, but it didn't really seem like much time had passed to allow them to do so. In fact, they came from a completely different direction when they went to look for them. The music for this episode, though, was great, and that could just be from a nostalgic point of view, but I personally believe the soundtrack in the original series really helps to set the mood for many of the scenes in the series, let alone this episode. Sure, eventually you'll notice it gets reused a lot in subsequent episodes, although that's kind of common for cartoons back then. But when the show wants you to know something spooky or funny or weird is going on, the music will change, and it all feels very, organic. It feels good. And this isn't something I can really say about newer versions, sadly, because aside from the chase music, you don't really sit back and really notice the music in the background, do you? Which honestly is a disservice to the people working on the show who work on the music, but that's just my opinion. In conclusion, I wouldn't say this is a perfect episode, even though my childhood nostalgia is battling with me on that one. But it is a great episode, even if by today's standards it probably wouldn't be, due to the series' formulaic and incredibly simple plot, which probably is going to make it hard to review. Still, if you want to see where the Scooby-Doo franchise began, this, in my opinion, is the best place to start. It allows you to sort of, I don't know, understand and appreciate the past. And I feel like most people should do that. Any generation, whether it's just be like some hipster or some little 5-year-old or whatever. I think that you should let this newer generation really come to appreciate the past by showing it to them. I mean, sometimes it's hard to appreciate when you're young. You're like, that's old, that's stupid. But I think eventually they would appreciate it. Because if I didn't watch Scooby-Doo when I was a kid, would I even really appreciate or give a crap about the new shows? I don't think so. So if you have a niece or a nephew or a child, I would really suggest you start them off with this show instead of something brand new. Just to at least give them, some insight into how far the Scooby-Doo show has come. I think they'll appreciate when they're older. Right now, they might just complain about how everything looks old. And that's been my review of episode 1. Let me know your thoughts on this episode if you're watching for the first time or the 100th. Also, I've just recently launched a Patreon where you can, of your own free will, help support me and the channel. There are currently 3 reward tiers of $5, $10, and $20, although you can donate any amount you want, even as low as $1. So consider checking that out by clicking the card on the screen. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. What can I say about episode 2, Hassle in the Castle? Well, first off, despite having the most boring monster, and I use that term loosely, this is actually a better episode overall compared to episode 1. It just moves us closer to that good old classic Scooby-Doo vibe, which again is odd considering episode 1 featured a classic Scooby-Doo monster who has appeared a few other times throughout the decades, and this episode had a magician dressed in a cheap Halloween ghost costume. Another thing that bugged me about this episode is the explanation of how Bluestone the Great pulled off all the ghostly tricks he did. I can buy the levitating that he did, even if it's odd how he uses it to give Shaggy a sandwich, but maybe I'm just not familiar with the trick, but the old smoke and mirror explanation sort of rings false to me. There seemed to be several moments in the episode where it couldn't have worked that way. If he was standing in front of a mirror and using light, or whatever, as a projection, then how come the Scooby Gang didn't see him? At all. I know. Looking too deep into a Scooby-Doo episode is really pointless. But that's actually always been a gripe with me about certain episodes within the franchise. If you have a villain doing crazy things, at least have a truly believable explanation for how he accomplished it. Besides a lackluster villain and a paper-thin reason for how he did all his tricks, I still believe this was a good episode. There seemed to be a lot more comedic moments compared to episode 1, and they all felt more like what you'd expect from the series. I think this moment here with Scooby messing with some magic hat is the funniest part of the episode. Next to what happens at the end, of course, with the chipmunk, or whatever it was. As I said, this episode is where the formula really started to come together. Fred devises a trap, Scooby and Shaggy become more comedic, and Daphne falls into a trap. Oh, and Velma does stuff, I guess. I actually miss this more competent and ingenious version of Fred, because more modern interpretations have made him more bumbling and thick-headed. I wonder if that's a reflection of how today's society views men. My musings about society's opinion on men aside, this has been my review of episode 2, Hassle in the Castle. I'm still working out how to structure my reviews for this old show. Obviously, it's hard to talk about the plot, as I've said before in my previous review, but I'll figure something out. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments below, and if you have some time, please consider checking out my Patreon. I'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Episode 3, A Clue for Scooby-Doo, is our first week episode of the season. While the plot structure, as I've pointed out before, is largely no different from episode to episode, there are quite a few head scratchers to talk about. What I mean is there are some moments that don't make any logical sense and act as little plot speed bumps throughout the episode. Let's start off with a very minor one that you could argue is simply cartoon logic at work, namely the ghost of Captain Cutler running with ease underwater. It really bothered me whenever this occurred because when you're that far underwater, you're not running through air. The density of water, from what I've read, is 775 times that of air, so you can't just run through it as easily as running on land. Is this a massive nitpick? Yes, but I had to bring it up. Now, you can throw that one aside by applying cartoon logic, as the characters have worked against logic before. However, my other two problems with this episode are not so easily dismissed, in my opinion. Towards the end of the episode, Shaggy accidentally sits down on a rock and it opens up a secret passage. You might ask, okay, how is that a problem? Well, because for one, they were underwater. Are you telling me that Captain Cutler managed to create not only a rock switch, but also either a fake rock front or a movable real one, all while underwater? Not to mention, I'm not sure if I just missed it or what, but I don't recall the gang explaining how Cutler got the boats underwater and through that passage. If they did, then my bad. I am working on this on no sleep, so you'll have to forgive me. Another big problem with this episode was really just the shoddy animation. Now, this is an old show, so I have given it some leeway in terms of the quality of animation, but for some reason, this episode had the characters undergoing some bizarre facial transformations. Sometimes not even looking like they're actual character models anymore. The beautiful Daphne at times looked fairly terrifying, or dead inside, and the animators somehow gave Shaggy blonde hair at one point. I'm not sure how you even make that mistake. So, while it was great seeing another classic Scooby-Doo villain, ultimately this episode got dragged down by some weird logic and poor animation. It's simply not that good of an episode, although it did have some okay comedy moments here and there, just not enough to shake my negative impression of the episode. Let me know if you agree with me or not in the comments below. Thanks for watching, take care. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Mind Your Own Business, the 4th episode, isn't what I'd call the best episode, but it is fairly entertaining with quite a few laughs to be had, even if they're certainly not gut-busting or anything. The gang in this episode somehow end up lost in the desert and run across Gold City, a ghost town which conveniently has a guest ranch nearby. I didn't know ghost towns were huge tourist attractions, but sure. I'll buy into that. And apparently, according to the character Hank, business has been poor because of the minor 49er. Now I wonder who that could be. I wonder who? Seriously, I know that this is a show for children, and the mysteries have never been that deep, but I mean, come on. Hank is quite literally wearing the exact same clothes the villain is wearing. Sure, you could argue it's a red herring, but it's quite obvious it's not. The height discrepancy is explained towards the end via stilts, but nothing ends up getting said of how he made his arms longer. But that's probably not that important. Not really as important as how he ends up going to jail. For what crime? Again, maybe for trespassing, but that's unclear. This really takes me back to an era of Scooby-Doo where the villains get arrested for things that probably wouldn't get them arrested normally. Oh dang, now that I think about it, the Scooby Gang is the Candace Flynn of this era, busting villains for weird things. All criticisms aside, if you can even call that a criticism, I did enjoy the episode for the most part. We finally get Daphne dubbed Danger-Prone Daphne, and Shaggy shows off more of his imitation skills, which sadly I don't think we see too often in the modern series. Hey, be cool, Scooby-Doo staff. Get on that, will ya? We get to see another classic Scooby-Doo villain before he was ruined by the live-action movies. Fire breathing? Get out of here. Although, watching this episode has me wondering how he ever became a classic villain at all. He's not that great at being a villain. He's just content to scare Scooby and Shaggy. But then again, that's something that a lot of villains did back in the day. They didn't try to hurt you most of the time, they just were content to stand there and look spooky before the inevitable chase scene. There were a few odd animation hiccups here and there, plus some other inconsistencies, but unlike one of the previous episodes, it doesn't take you out of the moment as much, which is good, because I hate when I start trying to spot animation mistakes while I'm watching an episode. Other than that, there's not much else to say about this episode. Great comedic moments, a decent plot, but with a few oddities here and there. That's what I thought about the episode. Now let me know what you thought about it. Head down to the comments and let me know. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Episode 5, Decoy for a Dog Napper, almost felt like I was watching an entirely different show altogether. It's clear that this episode is much different from the previous 4 episodes so far. First off, the episode started off during the day, and doesn't initially involve anything supposedly supernatural, although it does turn that way eventually. Plus, the gang offer their detective services before getting involved with the dog napping case. It's weird to say this after only 5 episodes, but it's kind of a breath of fresh air. I'd forgotten how rigidly formulaic the original series was, and even though I do still love it, it's nice to get a break in that formula even so early into the season. This episode almost felt like an animated Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew novel, and that's actually okay with me, as I'm a big fan of those series. In this episode, dogs have ended up being kidnapped, so the Scooby Gang use Scooby as a decoy to track the thieves back to their lair. But of course, things do go awry, and we end up with some funny moments like Scooby on a train track. Oddly enough, we get to see some tech in the gang's van that we hadn't really seen before until now. In later series, this is nothing new, but it is the first time in this series we've seen them use their van's tech to help in one of their mysteries, and I hope they continue to do so. It really adds to the whole detective thing, and up till now they've just happened across supernatural mysteries and ran around trying to solve them, even if it's unexplained at this juncture how they can afford the equipment. You gotta remember, Daphne hasn't been established as being rich yet. I think that's not until a couple of series later. Unfortunately, this episode isn't all that great. In fact, you could almost consider this the worst episode in terms of animation errors and inconsistencies, and I thought episode 2 was bad. The van is seen driving itself, at least 2 scenes flow horribly into one another, just a ton of weird animation goofs. I could go on for a paragraph or more about this, but I won't bore you with that. It's a good change of pace, but the episode is riddled with tons of mistakes that almost drag the entire episode down, but luckily do not. At least not to an unenjoyable level. Hopefully Season 2 will improve on some of Season 1's mistakes. We're not there yet, so let's just cross our fingers the rest of the episodes don't end up as mistake-friendly as this one. Its only saving grace was the fresh premise and the various jokes this time around. Not every episode will be that lucky. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Now let me hear yours. Let me know them in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Episode 6, What the Heck's Going On, starts off in a pretty scary way. As a kid, I think this episode did manage to scare me where some episodes of the original never did. Can you blame me? Listen to that ghostly wail. This episode also involves a fairly iconic Scooby-Doo villain, the ghost of Elias Kingston. If you've never seen this series, you may instead recall him from episode 1 of Be Cool Scooby-Doo. You can check out my review of that episode right now for more on that character. As usual, this villain is really a mix of threatening and just plain goofy, which is a characteristic of these early monsters. I talked about it briefly in my last review, I think, but this episode really continues the trend. At this point, I'm trying my best to figure out if that's a negative or a positive. I suppose it just really depends. At times, it's hard to take the monsters seriously when they do things like this. Other times, it adds to the comedy factor, like this. Either way, I do think he, at his better moments, was a more convincing villain than the previous ones, but that's just my opinion, of course. Another thing I mentioned in a previous review was the suspension of disbelief asked of viewers when it comes to the explanations for villains' activities. In this episode, we're told that a table flew around complete with Elias Kingston appearing within a crystal ball thanks to a fan and a closed-circuit camera. To me, that's a bit too much to ask considering how easily the table flew around. I also don't get how a camera would work that way, especially later in the episode when it's used to trick the ghost into Fred's less than amazing trap. It was just a net. Personally, this episode is a bit of a mixed bag for me. It has a good villain, but he has some less than great moments. Then you have a series of great comedic moments like Scooby being out for lunch or his ear tapping him to wake him up, but you also have some really jarring plot points that don't make a lick of sense. I managed to enjoy the good moments, but I won't pretend this episode did not have its problems. It was just okay. What about you though? What do you think of this episode? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you're new, be sure to check out my other videos by clicking some of the cards that popped up during this video. And if you like them, consider subscribing for more cartoon reviews every day. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Never Ape an Ape Man, the 7th episode of Scooby-Doo Where Are You, is special in that it also deviates from the established formula, much like Decoy for a Dog Napper did. Scooby-Doo is shown having a lot more courage than we've seen in previous episodes, or probably will ever again, and Daphne sets off a trap, which Fred ends up falling victim to, a slight reversal of their roles. Usually Daphne is the one falling for traps, hence her nickname, Danger Prone Daphne. Another way in which the episode breaks from the formula is the monster. This time, the monster's costume was his own, in that Carl was pretending to be the Ape Man while wearing the costume he has for the movie. While I do like that this is different from how the gang's mysteries usually go, I actually found the identity of the Ape Man incredibly boring and too easy to guess. I mean, from the second Scooby found Carl in a trunk, I knew he'd placed himself in there. When someone is running around pretending to be the Ape Man, and there's an actor who plays the Ape Man with neither of them being around at the same time, well, it's not too hard to put the pieces together. And an easily put together mystery is neither exciting nor fun. Plus, there was the issue of Carl having a Scooby-Doo mask. The bit was funny, I'll admit, but I was having an issue with how he got a hold of such a mask in the first place, or why he was playing games with them. I could spend more time talking about the problems I had with this episode in detail, but let's just leave it at that and say this wasn't a great episode. Boring concept for a villain, lackluster mystery involving said villain, and far too many leaps in logic, even for a Scooby-Doo episode. I will say, however, while incredibly rare for Scooby to be brave, I did enjoy seeing him take Ape Man to task several times within the episode. We won't really see that behavior very often, which is what makes it so much fun to see. And those are my short thoughts about this episode. If you have any you'd like to share, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Also, consider taking a second or two to look at my Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. For a while now, I've been worried that the Scooby formula would take a toll on me, and I'd be left struggling to really write a decent review for episodes hardly different from each other. But, funny enough, the last few episodes have all been fairly unique in how the Scooby Gang get involved in the mystery and solve it. Yeah, there's still the slight hint of the formula permeating throughout the episode, but it doesn't seem like an exact copy of the previous episodes. In episode 8, Foul Play in Funland, we're introduced to one of my favorite classic villains, Charlie the Robot. Now, I tend to gravitate towards the more chilling and creepy monsters than I do the silly ones. Give me Charlie the Robot or kooky Space Ghost over Ape Man or Indian Witch Doctor. And this episode does initially play up the creepy Robot Man with the use of his theme music whenever he appears. He can walk incredibly fast and not even a brick wall can stop him, making him both terrifying and dangerous for the gang to encounter. I think we've encountered some villains in the previous episodes who would have hurt our main characters, but I think Charlie could definitely have killed them if he'd gotten a hold of any of them. That's because he does end up just being a cold, emotionless robot, making him the first non-human villain the gang encounters in this season, if I recall. With all that praise regarding this villain, you'd think I'd consider this a great episode. Well, I do, but it does run into some problems. First off, the bad guy behind the robot gets redeemed in the dumbest way possible. See, Sarah Jenkins decides she doesn't want a robot around kids, so she sabotages it, causing it to almost hurt some kids. Great logic there, lady. What was that? What was your grand plan again? Mess with a robot and have it do what exactly? When the gang encounter him, all he's doing is running around. It wasn't until they messed with his circuitry via a giant magnet, which somehow needed to be explained to Fred, did Charlie go down for the count. And speaking of screw-ups, why did Sarah cut the cord to the magnet? The magnet was likely already messing up Charlie's insides. I don't understand the character's motivation. Nor do I get why she gets redeemed. Sure, she doesn't hurt anyone, so I definitely wouldn't say she needs to get arrested, but still. That aside, I do think this is an incredibly fun episode. It has plenty of laughs, from Scooby being trapped on a car with Velma, who lost her glasses, to even Charlie being hit by a train. Ah, violence comedy. You never let me down. And those are my thoughts. What are yours? Do you have a favorite evil robot villain? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Take care. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. I've had my fair share of criticisms with this series, and while some of them can be brushed aside as a product of the times or limited technology, I don't think all of it can be so easily dismissed. This episode, the backstage rage may not have had any noticeable scenes that flowed horribly into one another like certain past episodes, but it did have many moments where my suspension of disbelief broke. The villain of the episode, the Phantom Puppeteer, may as well possess supernatural abilities for how well he's able to pass off life-size puppets as real people, or control so many puppets. I'll accept that he could throw his voice to make it sound as if the puppets were talking. As it's already been established, the Shaggy can do so, but I can't force myself to believe the gang managed to not notice any of it, or how they not for one moment suspected the doorman of being the bad guy. He was the only other character in this episode, with the exception of the police officer at the end. I've said in the past, I really dislike when the franchise does a sloppy job of explaining how the villain of the day does what he does, and this episode is a really good example of that poor writing in my opinion. I know this is a series with a talking dog that no one finds strange, but there are some elements that need to make sense within the world the show takes place in. That large negative out of the way, there are still parts of the episode that I enjoyed. As poorly explained as he was, I felt that Puppeteer was a really creepy bad guy. His use of puppets calls to mind other villainous puppets like Chucky or Slappy. While the antics never evolved into quite that level of horror, you have to admit the scene where the gang discover the doorman is just a puppet was one of the creepiest moments in the episodes thus far. I just wish the entire episode had been a bit more like that. There was also plenty of comedic moments as usual. So, do I think this is a bad or a good episode? Well, despite my disdain for unexplained villains, the rest of the episode did manage to win me back, leading me to call this an okay episode. There's bound to be worse episodes out there, but there's also better ones too. What about you? What did you think of this episode? Leave me a comment down below, and also, who is your favorite evil puppet in fiction? Let me know. Thanks for watching. Take care. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. After a couple of somewhat lacking episodes, it's nice for an episode like Bedlam and the Big Top to come along with his classic Scooby-Doo flair. It's got laughs, a pretty good villain, and plenty more to entertain you. In this episode, the Scooby Gang end up investigating a so-called circus curse, and it ends up being Ghost Clown. Lame name aside, I definitely recall this episode from when I was a kid. I don't think it was so much his attire, although I'd say it is very memorable after all these years, but more so his gimmick of hypnotizing his victims into doing dangerous stunts. We see him use this on Scooby, Daphne, and Shaggy respectively in the episode. It leads to some of those humorous moments. I think the funniest one was definitely when Daphne was hypnotized into being a unicycler, just because she ends up chasing poor Shaggy and Scooby around. Oh, and for Shaggy's lame little bicycle joke.
On a unicycle.
She can't even ride a bicycle!
This episode also marks the first real unique capture the gang's ever done, namely hypnotizing the villain. I will admit the timing really felt off on when they pulled their mirrors out and the villain not, being able to realize that, but it was pretty cool to see them turn the clown's trick on himself. It certainly beats the typical traps that Fred is known for devising. It's also a little disappointing that we never got any clues as to the clown's identity, and he ended up being someone we'd never met before. Obviously, I'm not saying all mystery should definitely involve someone we've seen before, but it's more fun, don't you think? Not to mention, as iconic as the character is, it's sad to have him unmasked and just be some dude we never even saw before. Oh well, it's still an enjoyable episode. I'm glad there hasn't been as many huge glaring mistakes the past few episodes like some of the earlier ones. I'm a big Scooby-Doo fan and I'll always love the original show for what it is, but parts of it don't hold up well compared to newer shows or even later iterations in the franchise. But if you're not looking for anything complex, you won't get any better than this series. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Today we've got another Scooby-Doo Where Are You review as part of the Scooby Month celebration I've got going on. And that's episode 11, Hassle in the Castle. This is another episode that I definitely recall watching as a kid, and for the most part, it still holds up. It's nothing hugely special, mind you, but if you want to see the gang get chased around by a dude who can unnaturally switch from vampire to Frankenstein's monster to a werewolf, you'll get some amount of enjoyment from this episode. The gang are traveling, or at least invited, to a castle for some reason I don't think was ever mentioned, but then I couldn't remember even if it was. Fun fact, I tried to watch this episode while still being awake at 3 a.m. Yet here I am trying to piece together what I watched then with what I just finished watching this afternoon. They end up stopped by a fairly creepy and suspicious fortune teller who, if you can't tell, is definitely all three of the monsters in this episode. Even if I hadn't seen this episode as a child, I could have easily made the jump to that conclusion. It's still cool to see an episode featuring a master of disguise though, because it really goes hand in hand with how the gang's foes are usually grown men and women dressing up as creatures to commit crimes. So it makes sense for them to switch things up and have one guy be a series of different classic monsters, fooling anyone into thinking there's more than one person. I do have an issue with how quickly he managed to get in and out of costume. He'd have to place various duplicate costumes around the castle, and that seems just tedious. Then again, he's dressing up as monsters to search for treasure when a ski mask could also suffice. So maybe some degree of suspension of disbelief is in order. Otherwise, the episode was really fun. It was chock full of the humor typical in this series, and we jumped right into the mystery, which even had legitimate clues. Something this show, at this point, doesn't always have. And that's basically it. I loved the villain of the episode, even if I had some gripes about how he was doing what he did, and it was a really funny, good episode. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. In episode 12, Scooby-Doo and a Mummy 2, the gang get wrapped up in an after-hour mystery involving a curse, a mummy, and an ancient coin. For the most part, this is a fun episode that starts to show early signs of the humor and shenanigans the gang, or more specifically Shaggy and Scooby, get up to while confronting the various monster of the week. Things like inexplicably moving from pot to pot, or quickly changing costumes in order to fight off the mummy. All really funny scenes that definitely don't require the stage audience laughter to get you to crack a smile. Unfortunately, the episode is also littered with errors, whether technical or plot-wise, that bring it down a little. There's little things that aren't worth making too much fuss over, like a door constantly changing color, but then there's plot holes like there being no way the quick-drying cement could be that quick. Especially when Dr. Najib somehow makes one based on Scooby on the fly and accurately sculpts both the likenesses of the professor and Scoob. Yet somehow I don't think any of these really detract too much from the episode being the classic Scooby-Doo fun. They're obviously negatives and do warrant being pointed out, but if you can ignore them, you can probably find a way to focus on the positives and end up really enjoying the episode. As for those positives, there was just a lot of really small, but ultimately silly and fun moments spread throughout the episode, sort of like liverwurst sandwiches a la mode. Some of those are Scooby interacting with the cat statue and then the actual cat, or the gang being chased across a swimming pool by an electric saw. Man, what a long extension cord, am I right? The thing about the humor in these older Scooby-Doo cartoons is that they're more subdued than later iterations. As a kid, you might actually laugh out loud, but as an adult, I mostly found myself cracking a grin or maybe a slight chuckle. They're humorous, but not really in a gut-busting way. Hello, lords and ladies. Welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Well, I just finished watching episode 13, Which is Which, a few minutes ago, and boy, I should have gotten this up yesterday. What with it being Friday the 13th, and this being the 13th episode. Oh well, another missed opportunity. This episode is another one of those classic episodes I think we all can recall from our childhoods. The zombie, the witch, the swamp setting, it's all here and almost exactly as you remember it, if maybe not as good. There's not a lot to be said about this particular episode aside from pointing out another slew of continuity and animation errors, which seems to be typical of not only this series but maybe a lot of shows back then. Just so you know I'm not blowing smoke out my bum, I'll list a few I noticed. Daphne standing on a normal wooden floor, but then later it's revealed there's a rug. Now, according to the gang, she slid backwards, as evidenced by her footprints. Except later it's shown to be perpendicular to how the trapdoor opened. The background as the mystery van is being driven doesn't move at all. At one point, Scooby's paw matches Shaggy's shirt color, which is bizarre. There's honestly a few more, although they certainly do range from small to big. As for the plot of the episode, the gang go fishing but end up dealing with a zombie and a witch hunting for an armored car they accidentally drove into the swamp some years ago. It's your standard Scooby-Doo episode and features the usual laughs and comedy you'd expect. So much so, I don't feel the need to go into any greater detail than that. Honestly, despite enjoying this immensely as a kid, as an adult I can't say I was thoroughly impressed. The jokes didn't hit it off with me and the actual story wasn't all that interesting. I still enjoy the design of the zombie, as it's more voodoo than flesh-eating, but in time we'll see the show lazily give the same design to another monster. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. I'll admit I don't have much to say about episode 14, Go Away Ghost Ship. It's not a bad or boring episode, it just exists, if that makes any sense. Scooby and the gang volunteer their services to Magnus in order to help him find out who is stealing from his ships, which of course leads them to a ghost ship and its ghostly captain, Redbeard. Another one of Scooby's more iconic villains, Redbeard's actually appeared more than once within the franchise, which I think is more proof of his iconic nature, despite really just being a simple pirate design that is reused in a later iteration. I think what really sets him apart, thanks in part to his voice actor's great portrayal, is his presence and the threat of danger he represents. While in an early review I noted a monster that could have killed the gang, this is the first official time in the series they were threatened with actual death. Of course, this is the cartoon from the late 60s, so no real violence is going to get shown, but the comic does have Redbeard punch Shaggy in the face, so there's that. For the time, this was a really decent episode with a good amount of comedy, whether through jokes or physical humor, mostly from Scooby and Shaggy, of course. By today's standards, it probably wouldn't be seen as very good. In the end, while I recognize how fun this episode probably was, I didn't enjoy it all that much. And it wasn't even the errors this time, I just didn't feel that strongly towards it. I liked Redbeard and some of the jokes in the episode were funny, including there being just the most realistic scene shared between Daphne and Velma that made the former feel much more human than she had so far on the series.
For a ghost ship, there sure aren't many ghosts around.
Maybe they've gone haunting for a new house? Or out with a couple of old ghoul friends?
The 1969 series is classic for a reason, and certainly beloved by many, but it was only just the beginning and the characters hadn't yet had much in the way of personality infused into them. Scooby and Shaggy are easily the most defined, even at this juncture, but the other characters can come off a bit stiff. So that's why I enjoyed that moment way more than I thought it would. It felt like two teens having a conversation instead of spitting out plot. And that's all I really have to say on Go Away Ghost Ship. It's not the best Scooby-Doo episode of the season, even with one of its most iconic foes on display, but it still retains that classic flair, and there's certainly things you'll enjoy about the episode. Just maybe not in general. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. I think without a doubt this is my favorite episode of the season. Episode 15, Spooky Space Kook, introduces us and the gang to one of my favorite Scooby-Doo villains, the Space Kook. A lot of my love for this episode, even as a child, was due in part to the striking design of Space Kook. There's just something oddly great about a ghost astronaut with a skull for a head. From the glowing suit, to the cackling laugh, to the glowing red of his helmet, it's not something you think of when you think of the supernatural, and for the time, it must have been something very different. And his design isn't the only cool thing about him, he also makes for an iconic villain. When I was a kid, I remember being scared anytime I saw the way he looked when he was walking directly at the camera. I'm sure this shot may have been pulled off in earlier episodes or maybe even later ones, but with Space Kook it was just more visually appealing and spooky. It helped that his unearthly wail added to his mystique. But the episode doesn't just stop with a great monster, it also is probably the funniest episode we've gotten yet, at least in my personal opinion. Moments like this, when Shaggy and Scooby need to find the key they threw out, bring back memories of me laughing my butt off as a kid.
Oh no, another door! We gotta get that key and get out of here! Got it! Now we can get out of here!
And that wasn't the only good scene found within this 22-minute episode, but I won't spoil them all if you haven't seen it and would like to go check it out for yourself. While the bulk of this episode was excellent from start to finish, I did find fault with some minor things, such as the Kook's laughter being far too similar to the ghost from an earlier episode, even if it does suit his character. And the reason for Henry doing what he did, well, it wasn't the best of motives. Would the Air Force really be so afraid of one guy they'd sell the land for cheap, even if he was pretending to be an space ghost? My friend who holds the Air Force in high regards would be insulted at the very idea. Be that as it may, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better episode in the season than this. It had a fantastic villain, silly moments that will make you chuckle, and just a lot of fun in general. I'd easily rewatch it if I didn't already have more reviews to write. The never-ending struggles of a YouTube content creator. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Right off the bat, I think we have another fantastic classic Scooby-Doo episode with A Night of Fright is No Delight. If you haven't seen the episode in a long time, you may be more familiar with its modern counterpart, where there's a Will, there's a Wraith, from Be Cool Scooby-Doo. The new take on it was really funny, but the original is just as fun. Just like in the modern retelling, Scooby finds himself inheriting a great fortune from a man he saved years ago, and has to spend the night in a creepy mansion along with Sanders' other relatives. It's an insanely outrageous and downright amusing premise for an episode, and I just loved it. First off, the island mansion sets up the scene perfectly, and really lets you know the gang is in for a night of fright. It's also a very striking scene in and of itself. Almost feels right out of something like Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas or Dark Shadows. Now, I called the last episode the funniest episode to date, but I'll admit, episode 16 definitely gives it a run for its money with quite a few comedic moments that had me more than chuckling. Scenes like Scooby, Shaggy, and Velma being chased by a floating uniform piloted by a duck, or my favorite moment, this one.
Faster! They're like gaining on us!
If you don't laugh at that, you're not human. The rest of the episode may seem a little bare bones in comparison to the update it received in Be Cool Scooby-Doo, what with very little screen time being given to the relatives themselves, but I promise you it holds up very well even with the newer version in mind. This, to me, is actually the most intricate, involved episode yet. A few other episodes felt like not much was really going on, but the gang spent a good bit of the runtime exploring the mansion or escaping from the giggling green phantoms. Speaking of the ghosts, I adore these two villains so much. I think I said as much in the remake, but it's still true. Not missing a beat, the writers refused to let them sound too familiar to another ghost the Scooby Gang has encountered episodes ago, and instead gave them a really odd laugh. More like they're just saying gibberish, but I'm told it's more of a giggle. Hence why some refer to them as the giggling green phantoms. Either way, they were amazing in this episode, appearing all over the mansion causing problems. And it was hysterical how they had secret panels all over the place for some inexplicable reason. I suppose they were more funny than creepy, but that's not a bad thing. I could probably drone on and on about this episode, but let's wrap it up. Episode 16 is another amazing Scooby-Doo episode that if you've yet to experience for yourself, you should take the time to do so, and then maybe watch Be Cool Scooby-Doo's take on it. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. This is it folks, the season 1 finale of Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Does it hold up as a finale? Is it just as funny as the episodes that have come before it? All of those questions will be answered, well, now, actually. As far as pure entertainment factor, episode 17, That Snow Ghost, is a wonderfully fun episode. It's got a cool monster, the Snow Ghost, and not a bad mystery and adventure to boot. It's probably one of the better episodes this season, which goes to show that over the course of its first season, Scooby-Doo Where Are You did start to improve. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out some negatives before we get to some of the positives, like swallowing some bitter cold medicine before you're allowed to take a sip of your juice. First, much like many other episodes in this season, and no doubt in later episodes, there were some odd inconsistencies. At the end of the episode, a flying snow ghost is explained away by a pair of clear skis. A sound explanation, but if you think about it, it doesn't really add up. Why did the skis not leave any tracks? Or this first scene, which revealed he could fly. There's no way skis could do that. I think that's a pretty big mistake, which does impair the episode a bit. The rest were of a smaller nature, like Shaggy and Scoob not crossing a cliff, but then it shows the ghost stopping at one, meaning they should have come across it at some point, and he doesn't even follow them, though it's shown he's capable of doing so. Mistakes like these are of course not as aggravating as the big one I just mentioned, but they are still weird errors on the part of the writers and animators. I just get the feeling, given the era, animation was still going through its growth spurt, and these creators didn't always pay that close attention to the continuity of their episodes. This stuff still happens today, but not as frequent. Although it's one thing to have an animation error, which is just human error. it's another for there to be contradictions to the plot. But back to positives. The Snow Ghost, despite a somewhat lame name, was a really good monster for the episode. He put the gang in more danger than they've ever been in before, and even though it's not as inventive to do so now, a Yeti in a snow episode was a good choice. The episode had a great snowy and creepy atmosphere going on, what with the odd behavior of Greenway and Leech. Heck, I'd say out of all the civilian identities of our monsters, these were the two creepiest out of costume, and that's not something that happens often. I think, even counting the negatives, the finale was somewhat a success, again in terms of entertainment and humor. The episode did actually make me laugh, as the humor was probably more on point here than ever before, which is high praise given my reviews of some of the more recent episodes. It's a really good episode that could have been great if not for a series of errors along the way. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. It's been too long, but I'm finally jumping back into my Scooby-Doo Where Are You reviews with Nowhere to Hide, the first episode of Season 2. After months away from the series, there's a temptation to be overly positive about the episode, and so to get it out of the way, yes, it's great to be reviewing the show again, and it's still fun. I mean, there's no denying the show is still dated in many ways, but this is a pretty standard episode with all the amount of humor and shenanigans you'd expect from the old Scooby Gang. The gang find themselves dealing with a scientist, claiming to be transforming into the ghost of one of his ancestors' transformations. I'll let that one sink in. This Gecko fellow isn't just becoming Hyde, no, he's becoming the ghost of his great-great-grandfather, who was Hyde once. It's one of the more out there stories we've gotten yet. I don't know why the writers went with such a weird explanation, especially given it was never played that way. It was just outright taken at face value by our teen sleuths, who have almost never been at their most clueless. In fact, you can almost wonder how they met a man named Jekyll, and then come to the conclusion, at first, that he was not the ghost of Hyde they were looking for. Either the writers did that purposefully, which is still bad, or they didn't even notice how dumb it made their characters, which is equally as bad. The rest of the episode was fine. Like I said above, it's a standard Scooby-Doo episode, and that's generally good. The comedy wasn't at the peak you'd expect, but scenes like Hyde indicating he was gonna turn Shaggy into a toad and the subsequent chase scene, complete with song, were really funny. That and the gang pretending to be Hydes themselves, even if that shouldn't really make a lick of sense. The saving grace of the episode's central mystery plot was the realization that Jekyll really was Hyde and was framing his maid the entire time. The entire episode I thought it was Helga, because that's usually how simple these early episodes were. But I'll give credit to the writer. They really got me with this one. Although, as other fans have stated in the past, this does add the wrinkle of how he moves so fast, or why he had a trap door leading to his own lab. The episode's not perfect, as you can see. The choice of monster was nice, if bogged down with an incredibly dumb backstory, but was partially saved by a bait-and-switch twist. And the comedy wasn't at its best, but there were still some good moments here or there. All in all, I'd say it's a decent, if rough, episode. There's better episodes out there, but also worst ones. However, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Share those down below, and if you're interested in watching the episode, you can probably buy the season for cheap on Amazon, watch it on Netflix, or buy the episode on YouTube. Also, be sure to subscribe for more cartoon reviews. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Mystery Mask Mix-Up is an okay episode, I'll tell you right off the bat. It's set in what I can only assume is a Chinese neighborhood in San Francisco, and involves Daphne buying a mask that actually belongs to Mr. Fong to help hide information about his smuggling operations. It's a shake-up from the usual Scooby-Doo caper, but I wouldn't call the ghost of Zen Tu all that compelling. Now, the mask he wears is cool and all, but himself, not so much. He doesn't do anything interesting or menacing other than his henchmen trying to kill Daphne and the others. See, that's what makes those two characters more interesting than Zen. Unfortunately, besides the amazing chase sequence across town and rooftop, those two don't get that much spotlight. Also, while not something I'm terribly upset at, there were some racist moments regarding Scooby's buck teeth while imitating a Chinese person. Again, not an inclusion I'd get personally up in arms about, but maybe you would, so take that into account. Fred, Daphne, and Velma spend quite a bit of time trapped in this episode, which could be a nice change of pace, yet it also doesn't give them much else to do but wait off screen for Scooby and Shaggy, who get more things to do. And personally, the most fun in this episode was the beginning, Scooby being used as a motorcycle, and how Zen was trapped. Other than that, it's easy to just skip this episode by, unless you're feeling overly nostalgic. What about you? Any thoughts about this episode? Share them down below, and be sure to subscribe for more weekly reviews of Scooby-Doo Where Are You? To watch this episode, consider checking out Boomerang's streaming service. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. If you want to get early access to my videos, consider joining my Patreon. The link can be found to it in the description and after the video. Thanks. Believe it or not, I've actually talked about this episode, Jeepers, It's the Creeper, on this channel before in my 5 classic monsters I'd like to see on Be Cool Scooby-Doo video I did back in January for Scooby Month. I'll include an annotation to it at the end of the video if you'd care to watch it. As I said there, the Creeper is hands down one of the most iconic Scooby villains there is. From his mannerisms to his angry yells, most of us who grew up with this show vividly recall this episode or parts of it. And for good reason. It's a fun episode with a silly, if creepy, antagonist for the gang to butt heads with. It also presents us a peek at the characters' social lives, as the episode begins with them attending a barn dance. It's an incredibly superficial look, but at the time, and even now to an extent, it's refreshing to see the teens act like, well, teens from time to time. They're always so knee-deep in mysteries to solve, there's never much time to have any fun. Case in point, the Creeper cuts their fun short and thus begins an episode-long chase with the teens outmaneuvering the villain at every step. This is probably one of the more funnier episodes of the bunch thanks to comedic timing, Scooby's little chick, and the incredibly angry but dense villain, who happens to be the bank manager. Yes, very shocking. Actually, at the time, I'm certain that reveal did come as a shock, thanks to the manager seeming well respected, and the writers forcing in a red herring later in the episode, namely the crazy old hermit in the mountains. Sadly, that red herring, even by today's standards, was really weak. The character is definitely fun with that classic Hanna-Barbera high-pitched voice, but you could sense how forced his character was. He's in the episode all of a few seconds, and it's super obvious he's merely a red herring, especially when Fred says aloud that he's certain the hermit is the Creeper. His inclusion is all the more pointless when it's immediately blown out of the water when the gang get back to their van and discover the real Creeper waiting for them. So what's the point in making it seem like he's the monster again? Oh well, so much for that. Luckily, that doesn't really hurt the entire episode. It's just the weakest link. The rest makes good on the promise of that good old classic Scooby-Doo fun. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. This episode, Scooby's Night with Frozen Fright, is probably not the strongest of this season's episodes. A thought-out caveman isn't exactly my idea of a compelling antagonist, and even if it was, this episode also had a few too many flimsy excuses for certain actions taken by the characters to really be anything that great. Let's back up a bit though. The plot for the episode has the gang discovering a frozen Iceman and taking it to Oceanland, where it was originally headed. Someone switches on the heater, and it appears that the caveman breaks free and attacks one of the marine biologists, Professor Wayne. The gang investigate, and of course run into the caveman himself. Right off the bat, we have some inconsistencies, like how Wayne turned on the heater and as the camera pans, somehow was seated at his desk. He would have needed to move like lightning fast to pull that off. Canonically, it's simply poor writing / planning on the part of this episode's writers or animators. In my head, I'd probably imagine Wayne had an accomplice who just never got caught. Sadly, that's not really the case, although it would be fun for some fanfiction. Then there's the matter of Shaggy providing the excuse to go back to Oceanland to retrieve his pole, which allows the gang to make the discovery of the caveman being missing. Others have pointed it out before, and I agree it's an incredibly weak excuse. Normally I'd say certain mistakes could be overlooked or not make much of an impact on a review, as long as the rest of the product is of high quality. Like, I'm not going to call an episode rubbish just for a door being painted one way, then changing color in the next scene if the writing and comedy are pretty good. But considering both these are significant to the plot of the episode, I think it's worth pointing out. There's some quality moments in the episode, such as an ice block being slammed against a keyhole so hard it makes a key, as ridiculous as that sounds, or Scooby, Velma, and Shaggy subsequently riding an ice block to shore. But I can't say the rest of the episode holds up that well. There's probably a reason why I don't see people regarding this episode as one of the classic ones. The caveman is just not that fun a villain, and the episode lacks enough things going on to counter some of the negatives. What about you though? Did you enjoy the episode? If you have any thoughts on this one, leave a comment down below. While you're still here, check out my merch store or Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Fun is a word that's usually synonymous with anything Scooby-Doo related, but trust me when I say this episode is very fun. It's everything you love about the series, including the hilarious antics of its cast and villains. You want a monster with no head, laughing it up? Check. Scooby and Shaggy acting like cowards and getting up to amusing fun? Check. Monster chasing them on a balloon? Check, check, and check. Honestly, this episode was exactly what I needed to lift my spirits when I was watching this late at night. I won't say I was laughing every second, but I did crack up several times throughout Haunted House Hang-Up. It's got a really cool setting with what almost looks like an old southern mansion, a creepy headless monster, and an actual twist on the old Scooby-Doo formula. This probably marks the first instance in where the bad guy isn't all that bad to begin with, and there's a second antagonist revealed who's been present throughout the entire episode via some noises. It's some smart writing on the show's part, even if the real villain has the laziest costume ever. If he was going for a ghost, he failed. But that's really my only complaint. I don't have much else to say, so I'll close with my favorite bit from the episode, the high-speed balloon chase. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. What can I say about A Tiki Scares No Fair other than it's okay? Well, to be fair, it's a good episode. I just really didn't like it as much as other episodes this season. It's got a few really good jokes and humor scenes, an adequate monster, and a cool setting, but I just don't have that much else to say about it. So, I'm gonna try something different. Here's a few things I enjoyed about the episode. Shaggy begging for a Scooby snack. Fred's oh-so-obvious comment about danger.
Fred, it might be a way out.
Or a way in to more danger.
Velma hiding in hay. This actually reminded me of her allergies to hay, I think, in Beagle Scooby-Doo. So there's some cool trivia about that show. It looks like they went for a deep cut. Here's another Velma-centric one. I like how she gets in on the act that, back in the day, would normally consist of just Scooby and Shaggy. The constant switching scene here, this was probably the funniest scene in the episode. And yeah, those are just some of my favorite moments from the episode. What are yours? Sound off down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Sorry for the extended wait, but it's finally time to discuss Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Werewolf. The episode has the gang encounter the ghost of a werewolf while on an innocent camping trip, because mysteries follow them no matter where they go, even to the moon. In a bit of a twist, I'd like to talk about the monster of this episode first. I really love its design. Despite being a werewolf, or werewolf ghost, or whatever the heck this thing is, it looks nothing like its namesake thanks to its green skin, fur, who knows, but it's so striking and unique that I don't care if it's dumb. The animators could have made him a regular werewolf, but because they'd already done that before, they came up with something incredibly distinct, and I love it. It's just so unfortunate that the scheme requiring a full man to create the myth of Silas Long, half man, half wolf, is far more dumb than you'd think. He's a sheep smuggler. A smuggler. Of sheep. So, yeah, it's not the most astounding of reasons to put on a werewolf disguise. Oh, and his werewolf growl sounds more like an angry small dog. So, there's that. Luckily, the episode itself, minus that weird motivation, is pretty good. The episode is funny with scenes like Shaggy cutting his shirt off to escape Fred, or him and Scooby cutting through the floor to escape the monster, and a few other more memorable moments. The various backdrops the gang investigate are spooky and involve plenty of great scenes as well. Now, I know that's not much to go on, but this really is a fun episode, and I'd highly suggest you watch it. It's not a classic, but with a unique monster and location, it sets itself apart from the remainder of Season 2. So, what did you think of this episode? Did you ever watch it as a kid, and do you have a favorite part? If you've not seen it, please do. There's plenty of ways to watch it. Thanks for watching, and take care. Hello lords and ladies, welcome back to Scooby Month on Cartoon Hangout, your place for all things cartoon. Here we are, the final episode of Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Seems almost fitting that we begin Scooby Month this way. Does it stand out as the final episode to the series? Not really. Given the period, I doubt I should have expected any big send-off. They probably knew this wasn't the end, and thus episode 8, Don't Fool with the Phantom, is as typical an episode as it can get. The gang stumble across another mystery. The Wax Phantom, who is allegedly a wax figure brought to life by a creepy-looking former employee of the TV station, Grisby. Of course, as you can easily imagine, he's a red herring. That's how it goes with its older series. It's almost never the person the show wants you to believe is the villain. In fact, the villain is literally the only other person missing in the episode. Yes, it's Roger Stevens. Am I a detective now? Give me my badge, I'm ready to solve crimes in the 60s. Detective Archaic, solving fairly easy crimes and looking for dames to romance. What a show that would be. Right, moving on though. The episode is still entertaining. I mean, at this point in the series, at least from our vantage point in the far off future, a lot of the fun isn't figuring out who did it, but the shenanigans the gang get up to trying to work it out for themselves. As a kid though, maybe it was once part of the fun. I really enjoyed a lot of the humor from Shaggy and Scooby in this one too. Either them tricking the others and running away so as to avoid being bait again, or making a joke about the outdated nature of putting your victims on a conveyor belt. They were good, classic jokes that had me chuckling throughout. We also get to see a bit of danger-prone Daphne in this one, though it actually helps, not hinders our intrepid sleuths. As I've reviewed this series, I've actually taken notice of Daphne not being that much of a damsel or getting into much danger at all. It's possible that from here on out, that trait is accidentally given to her, and thus ended up earning her the reputation of danger-prone and damsel. That, or folks misremember the amount of instances in which she was the damsel or danger-prone. Honestly, that could be right from where I'm standing. The monster is as simple as being a wax figure, so it's no surprise he isn't often brought up when fans think of the most iconic foes of the Scooby Gang. Still, his creepy moans and voice are really spooky and help make him a good villain in this episode. In that way, maybe he's a little underrated. While it's not a spectacular end to such a classic series, it doesn't go out on a particularly bad note and gives us all the fun and humor we expect from Scooby-Doo Where Are You? And I think that's a win.